I had arrived at the registry that morning with a strange mix of anticipation and dread, wearing the pale blue shirt she once told me made me look like sunlight breaking through clouds, as if some small detail could anchor me to a world that now felt tenuous and unsteady. The air inside the building was a sterile, unnatural cold, smelling faintly of polished wood, ink, and the ghost of too many whispered promises. My ticket number blinked at me on the screen, static and indifferent, and for a moment I felt a pang of absurdity, as if my entire life had been reduced to waiting for a number to be called, to step forward and validate my own existence in some official ledger. I had imagined this day countless times, standing there beside her, holding her hand while she laughed at my nervous jokes, pretending not to notice the tiny tremor in her fingers as she gripped mine. But the reality was a hollow echo of my imagination. She wasn't coming. She had stood me up again. The thought was almost laughable if it weren't so painfully familiar, a pattern I had seen repeat too many times to deny it. I thought about the mornings when we had talked endlessly about this moment, how she had spun a story of forever in the quiet of her bedroom, sunlight streaming through the curtains, her hair catching the light in a way that made everything ordinary seem extraordinary. I remembered the way her laughter had once filled the air, each note buoyant and effortless, as though the universe itself had conspired to make her happy. And yet here I was, alone, the air around me thick with the weight of expectation that had nowhere to land but on my own chest. I sat down in one of the metal chairs against the wall, its cold surface biting through my thin shirt, and tried to reconcile the memory of her with the present absence. It was strange how absence could feel so full, so tangible, as if she had carved a space in the room that only she could occupy, and my body remembered that space even though she wasn't there. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a rapid reminder that I had invested myself too deeply, that I had let someone else's whims dictate the rhythm of my days. And then, almost without thinking, I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled the woman across the room and drew her curious glance. But I didn't care. It was a laugh at the absurdity of my own devotion, at the way I had tied my heart to someone whose presence was unreliable, inconsistent, fleeting. I remember the mornings we had spent talking about names for the life we would build together, about the small apartment we would furnish with thrifted treasures and the scent of coffee and old books. I remember the way she had promised to never leave, how she had said that moments like these were meant to be cherished, to be witnessed together. And now, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, that promise felt like a cruel joke, a ghost hovering over my shoulder, reminding me that love could sometimes be a series of absences rather than presences. I watched the other couples around me, hands intertwined, gentle smiles exchanged, whispered reassurances, and felt an almost unbearable longing. Their joy seemed effortless, natural, and in contrast, my longing was jagged, awkward, and entirely consuming. I tried to summon a sense of calm, reminding myself that this wasn't the end, that perhaps there was something else waiting outside these walls, something unbound by our inconsistencies, something I could claim as my own. But the rational voice was weak against the tidal wave of disappointment that had settled like a stone in my chest. Each passing second was a reminder of the countless promises I had made to myself, the resolutions to be patient, understanding, and loving, only to see them unravel in the quiet cruelty of someone else's absence. And yet, even in this crushing disappointment, I felt the first flicker of clarity, like a single candle in a darkened room. It was not just her absence that had brought this ache. It was my insistence on defining my happiness through her actions. I had given away too much of myself, too much of my heart, too much of my time, and now the stark reality of that trade settled in, bitter and undeniable. I could not continue to anchor myself to someone who treated my presence like an option, not a certainty. And in that quiet realization, a strange mix of grief and relief began to bloom. The grief of the dream that would never come to pass, for the gentle hands and the laughter that had once made the world feel softer, warmer, brighter. And the relief, a subtle, almost imperceptible easing of tension, as though I were being gently untied from a knot I had spent years tightening. I left the registry that day with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing the quiet vow I had made to myself. I would reclaim my own rhythm, my own sense of worth, and I would no longer tether my heart to someone who did not value its constancy. The sunlight outside felt sharper, almost cruel in its clarity, but I welcomed it, because for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was stepping out of the shadow of someone else's indecision and into the faint, trembling glow of my own freedom. I wandered through the streets after leaving the registry, letting the city absorb me in its indifferent rhythm, feeling the uneven cobblestones beneath my shoes and the faint crunch of autumn leaves caught in the wind. Each step was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if I were trying to mark a boundary between the person I had been when I waited for her and the person I could become if I finally freed myself from her unpredictable gravity. The city smelled like rain-washed asphalt, roasted coffee beans in distant bakery ovens, all mingling into a scent that was at once comforting and achingly lonely. People brushed past me, heads down, immersed in conversations, the hum of traffic, or the press of their own ambitions, entirely unaware of the quiet collapse and tentative reconstruction of a man walking among them. I noticed a small cafe tucked into a corner, the kind with soft, amber light spilling onto the street, a hand-painted sign swaying gently in the wind. Meow's Cafe. It seemed absurdly poetic that such a name would greet me at a moment of profound disorientation, as if the universe itself had orchestrated a small, whimsical reminder that life carried on, indifferent to human heartbreak, yet filled with little sanctuaries of warmth and solace. I paused, breathing in the gentle aroma of roasted coffee, and allowed myself to step inside, feeling the sudden embrace of warmth against my chilled skin. The interior was small and intimate, with wooden tables polished by years of cups and elbows, and the faint hum of a piano playing in a corner, notes drifting lazily through the air. I chose a seat by the window, the one that offered a view of passers-by, a world moving steadily forward while I wrestled with the dissonance between my memories and my reality. I ordered a black coffee, its steam curling into the cool air like tiny ghosts of comfort, and let my gaze wander, trying to absorb the quiet life around me. The barista moved with soft, deliberate grace, arranging cups and saucers with care, and I found myself fascinated by the mundane elegance of her movements, a small reminder that beauty persisted even in ordinary, overlooked gestures. For a long time, I simply sat, watching, listening, feeling the pulse of my own heart sync with the rhythm of the cafe. I thought of her, as I always did, and tried to trace the contours of my attachment, to understand how I had let someone else's inconsistency dictate the tempo of my days. The memories rose unbidden. The way she laughed when I made ridiculous jokes, how her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she was genuinely amused, how she used to lean close to whisper secrets only I was allowed to hear. And with each recollection, a strange mixture of tenderness and exasperation surfaced. Tenderness of the intimacy that had existed, exasperation at the repeated disappointment, the silent absences that had begun to accumulate like unpaid debts on my heart. I realized then that avoidance, which had seemed like a punishment, was actually a gift I owed myself. Blocking her, stepping away from the constant pull of expectation, was not an act of cruelty, but a liberation, a reclamation of my own narrative, unmediated by someone else's whims. I traced the rim of my coffee cup with fingertip, feeling the warmth seep into my skin, and recognized a subtle truth that had been eluding me. I had spent so much energy bending toward her presence that I had forgotten the contours of my own life. Each day I spent waiting for her had been a day partially stolen from me, fragment of myself dispersed in the hope that she would choose to show up, to honor the promises she had made. And yet now, in this quiet sanctuary of amber light and soft music, I began to see the edges of those fragments come together, forming the faint outline of something whole. I watched the people outside the window, lovers holding hands, strangers hurrying past, a dog sniffing the corner of a lamppost, and felt an unexpected kinship with them, a reminder that the world moved forward regardless, and that I, too, could move forward without her. My chest loosened slightly, a subtle exhalation of relief mingled with grief, as I admitted the bitter reality that I would not be waiting at the registry any longer, that I would no longer let my life orbit around someone who treated my presence as optional. The grief was palpable, an ache that hummed through my veins, but it was tempered by a quiet hope, a fragile sense that I could reconstruct my days around my own needs, desires, and passions. In that moment, I realized that avoidance was not merely absence. It was a deliberate, conscious choice to prioritize myself, to allow space for new patterns of thought, new joys, and perhaps new connections untainted by the history of disappointment. I allowed myself to linger in the cafe for hours, sipping coffee, watching the sunlight shift across the street, observing the delicate dance of human life around me, and feeling, for the first time in months, that I was truly untethered. It was a strange, disorienting liberation, one that carried both the weight of loss and the promise of renewal, and in that tension, I discovered the quiet power of self-determination. I didn't need her validation to exist. I didn't need her presence to define my happiness. I could exist fully, richly, painfully, and beautifully on my own terms. And as I left the cafe later, the sunlight felt warmer, the air crisper, and the city less alien, because for the first time in a long time, I was walking freely, unbound, untethered, and entirely my own. After that day at the registry and the quiet sanctuary of the cafe, I began to notice the subtle ways life insisted on moving forward, even when I felt frozen in the stagnation of longing and disappointment. The first morning after, I woke to the soft hum of sunlight through my curtains, painting patterns on a floor that felt impossibly gentle, almost conspiratorial, as if the universe was trying to remind me that small beauties existed even when heartbreak weighed heavily on the chest. I made coffee, not the hurried, bitter coffee of someone grasping for distraction, but a slow, deliberate ritual, letting the beans grind between my fingers, the aroma filling the tiny apartment like a warm promise. Each sip was an act of grounding, a conscious reclaiming of my own body, my own senses, my own time. For months, maybe even years, I had let the presence or the absence of someone else dictate the rhythm of my mornings. I had measured happiness in her attention, grief in her silence. But now, I began to measure life by the subtle textures of my own existence. The way sunlight bent across a dusty windowsill, the gentle groan of the floorboards as I moved across the apartment, the quiet satisfaction of making something nourishing for myself without the shadow of expectation. Avoiding her, blocking her, had not been a cruel gesture. It had been a necessary act of reclamation. Each day that I didn't see her, didn't receive a notification, didn't feel the surge of anxiety at wondering whether she would come through or vanish again, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible lightness in my chest. It was not immediate liberation. It was gradual, like the first tender shoots of spring after a long, bitter winter. The grief of what could have been still lingered, an undercurrent of memory and longing that refused to vanish entirely. I thought about the registry, the empty chair beside me, the ticket number blinking on the screen with quiet indifference, and I allowed myself a tiny, bitter laugh. It had been absurd to tie so much of my hope, so much of my emotional investment, to a single moment, to a single person's presence. And yet, that absurdity was the very thing that had taught me to value my own boundaries, the importance of preserving the spaces of my heart for someone or something that could honor them consistently. I began to explore the city more deliberately, walking through streets I had once known intimately, noticing details I had overlooked in the obsession with her presence. The texture of brick walls, the uneven pattern of cobblestones, the way shadows of tree branches dance across shop windows. It all became a meditation, a slow reclamation of the world as my own. And in those walks, I noticed a subtle echo of her absence. A cafe that once held her laughter seemed quieter. The bookshop where she lingered felt slightly hollow. But these were not sorrows to be mourned endlessly. They were reminders that the spaces I shared with her no longer defined me. I sat by fountains, watching water ripple over stone, listening to the clatter of coins and the distant laughter of strangers, and realized that there was a rhythm to life that did not require her, a melody that was mine alone to interpret. Freedom, I discovered, was not the absence of memory or longing. It was a conscious choice to no longer allow someone else's inconsistency to dictate the architecture of my heart. I started writing again, small notes at first, capturing fleeting thoughts, sensations, emotions, without the need for validation, without the pressure of sharing them with her or anyone else. Words became a quiet companion, a witness to the slow unraveling of attachment and the gentle reconstruction of self. Each sentence I wrote was a brushstroke of autonomy, a small affirmation that my story did not require her presence to be meaningful. And yet, even in these moments of self-possession, a subtle ache remained, a soft, almost sacred grief for the intimacy that existed, for the laughter, the whispered promises, the imagined tomorrows that had dissolved into absence. But the ache no longer demanded action. It could exist quietly alongside liberation, a paradoxical coexistence of loss and renewal. I met friends again, not in the desperate hope of distraction, but in genuine desire for connection, for warmth, for human presence uncolored by obsession. I laughed without calculating its weight, spoke without filtering through the lens of what she might think, and realized how much of myself had been muted in the pursuit of her attention. Avoiding her was not about erasure. It was about affirmation, about declaring to myself that my existence, my joy and my heartbreak, my laughter, all belonged to me first. And as the days unfolded, I felt the first real stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Not the manicured, curated possibility of someone else's life, but the raw, unformed potential of my own, waiting patiently for me to engage with it. I knew, with a quiet certainty, that this path was uncharted, that there would be moments of doubt, moments when a memory of a smile or the ghost of a promise might threaten to pull me back. But I had already begun to map the contours of my independence, to chart the boundaries of my emotional geography with the precision of someone who had learned from both neglect and devotion. And in that mapping, in the careful tending of my own inner world, I discovered a strange, intoxicating power, the ability to exist fully, richly, and vulnerably without waiting for permission, for attention, for validation from the person who had once held my heart like a delicate, precarious object. Freedom, I realized, was not absence. It was the courage to reclaim the spaces that had been ceded, to nurture the fragments of myself that had been left in the shadow of longing, and to step forward, unburdened, untethered, and quietly radiant in my own unfolding story. Days turned into weeks, though they felt more like fragments of time stitched together by habit and intention than a linear progression. I had stopped checking my phone obsessively, had stopped scanning every corner of my life for a trace of her presence, and in the absence of that compulsion, the world began to settle differently around me. Mornings were no longer a battleground of expectation and disappointment, but a canvas for small rituals. The slow bloom of sunlight through my curtains, the way the coffee steam twisted in the soft morning light, the quiet cadence of pen against paper as I recorded observations, fragments of thoughts, reflections on life reclaimed. I walked streets I had once known only in her shadow, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The subtle arch of a wrought iron gate, the way the lamplight bounced off rain-slicked pavement, the faint scent of jasmine escaping from a narrow alley. Each observation felt like a reclaiming, a statement that my attention, my presence, was no longer contingent on her whims. I began to frequent the Meow's Cafe regularly, finding a quiet sanctuary in its amber glow and the soft clatter of cups. I watched couples and friends converse, noting how easily they inhabited their connections, and rather than envy, I felt a curious kind of awe, a recognition that intimacy and joy existed beyond my entanglement with her, and that I could cultivate these experiences on my own terms. I started to engage with people differently, noticing the subtle language of kindness in strangers, the nod of acknowledgement from a barista, the hesitant smile from a passerby, the gentle greeting from someone sharing the same bus or park bench. Slowly, I realized that life was not merely to be endured in the absence of someone else. It could be noticed, cherished, and even transformed when I was fully present. And yet, in the quiet corners of my mind, she lingered, a shadow that refused to dissolve entirely. Not in the intrusive, all-consuming way that once dominated my thoughts, but as a faint echo of memory. The warmth of her hand in mine, the way her laughter curved upward like sunlight across the horizon, the subtle inflections of her voice that once made ordinary words feel profound. I allowed these memories to exist without letting them dictate my actions, as though observing them from a distance rather than swimming in their current. Avoiding her, blocking her, had become a deliberate, conscious practice, an act of self-preservation, and with it came a strange mixture of peace and tension. Peace, because I was no longer subject to the unpredictability of her presence. Tension, because the world I had imagined with her still flickered occasionally, like a candle in a drafty room. But instead of despair, I found clarity. The flicker did not control me. It was merely a reminder that the past existed, but it did not define my trajectory. I began writing longer, more structured reflections, sometimes spilling across pages, capturing both the minutiae of daily life and the sweeping arcs of emotion I had once tried to compress into fleeting moments with her. I wrote of mornings, cafes, empty streets, the gentle hum of rain, and the quiet liberation of feeling my own heartbeat without it being tethered to someone else's rhythm. In those hours of writing, I discovered the power of intentional solitude, the richness of self-reflection, and the subtle beauty of a life observed closely, measured carefully, and inhabited fully. One evening, I lingered at the cafe past closing, watching the golden light fade to twilight, and the city streets darken, illuminated by street lamps and the occasional car. I realized that I had been learning to inhabit my own presence in the world, to exist fully and vulnerably without leaning on the scaffolding of someone else's attention. The world did not require her to feel complete, and neither did I. Yet, there was an inevitable moment of reckoning when she reached out. Not with apology, not with explanation, but with a kind of message that carried the sharp edge of expectation, as though her absence had never been noticed, as though the time I had taken to reclaim myself was irrelevant. I stared at her words, the familiar mix of casual charm and subtle provocation, and felt the first surge of a different power. Not longing, not attachment, but discernment. I did not respond. I did not fumble for words that might placate her or reconcile her presence with my life. Instead, I breathed deeply, felt the weight of the freedom I had nurtured, and let the notification fade into irrelevance. Her reach, which once held the gravity of my entire emotional world, now barely registered as a ripple across the steady waters of my self-possession. Avoidance, I realized, was not the absence of feeling. It was a cultivation of a landscape where my emotions were my own to navigate, free from the capricious tides of someone else's choices. I walked home that night under a sky brushed with indigo and the faint sparkle of distant stars, and for the first time in months, I felt untethered, luminous in my own unfolding story, and quietly, fiercely alive. Weeks passed, and with each one, the sensation of freedom deepened, subtle but undeniable, like the slow seep of sunlight through a half-open curtain, warming spaces I hadn't realized were frozen. I began to notice how my own presence had become sufficient, that I didn't need her attention to validate my existence, that the rhythm of my life could be set entirely by me, and that in that autonomy lay a quiet, profound power. I walked through the city in the early morning, when the streets were still brushed with the soft glow of dawn, and marveled at how unnoticed details could fill a heart that had once been tethered entirely to someone else. The way pigeons hopped along the edges of cobblestones, the faint hiss of steam from manhole covers, the delicate scent of fresh bread wafting from a bakery. It all became poetry in motion, a world that demanded observation, reflection, and appreciation. At Meow's Cafe, my sanctuary, I discovered that I had begun to inhabit my own thoughts without judgment, allowing memories of her to drift in and out without the clenching anxiety that had once accompanied them. I would sit for hours, a notebook open, sometimes penning letters I would never send, exploring the contours of my own heart, charting the landscape of my emotions, and savoring the profound realization that I was capable of fully feeling without dependence on her presence. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of people in the cafe and recognize the subtle elegance of their interactions, a gentle laugh shared over spilled coffee, the brush of a hand that spoke of intimacy without drama, the quiet patience with which someone attended to another's needs. These observations were no longer bittersweet reminders of what I had lost. Instead, they became lessons, glimpses into how connection could exist without chaos, how intimacy could thrive in mutual respect, and how love, when it arrived, would not demand my self-erasure. I began to take longer walks through the city, exploring neighborhoods I had once ignored, discovering small gardens tucked behind wrought iron gates, noticing murals on brick walls that conveyed joy, sorrow, or humor, and realizing that life was composed of infinite small stories, each one complete without requiring validation from a single individual. Yet, even amidst this quiet expansion of perspective, there were moments when her shadow lingered. I would pass a bookstore where we had once lingered for hours, and my chest would tighten at the memory of her leaning close to point out a title she loved, the gentle curve of her lips in a secret smile. I felt the ache, but it was no longer a tether. It was a faint pulse, a soft reminder that attachment had once existed, and that human hearts were capable of depth, and that this depth could now be directed inward. One evening, as rain fell in a soft drizzle against the cafe windows, I watched the water bead and trickle down the glass, distorting the shapes of passers-by into abstract forms, and I realized how much my own perception of the world had shifted. I was noticing nuances, The interplay of light and shadow, the subtle inflection in someone's tone, the quiet gestures of empathy that had previously been drowned out by obsessive focus on her. Avoiding her had not only freed me from the unpredictability of her attention, it had opened my senses to the richness of a life I had neglected while waiting. I felt a deep gratitude for solitude, for the space in which I could nurture my own growth, for the small rituals of observation, reflection, and creation that now define my days. And yet, the world was not static. One evening, an unexpected ping from my phone pulled me briefly back into the orbit I had tried to escape. It was a message from her, casual, almost flippant, hinting at familiarity and expectation, as though she believed the passage of time had not altered the dynamic between us. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening for a moment before reason and reflection asserted themselves. I did not reply. My thumb hovered, then withdrew, and I felt the strange, exhilarating power of choice. I could respond, I could engage, I could allow her back into the delicate ecosystem of my heart, but I chose not to. I chose my own rhythm, my own boundaries, my own life. In that decision, there was a quiet triumph, a moment of subtle euphoria that came not from vengeance or spite, but from the recognition that my existence was no longer contingent on her whims. Avoidance had transformed into a form of sovereignty, and in that sovereignty, I discovered clarity I had never possessed when I had allowed my heart to orbit hers. I walked home that night under the hush of streetlights, the rain leaving delicate silver patterns across asphalt and leaves, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt a profound, unshakable sense of self. My grief had not disappeared. It lingered like a soft hum, a reminder that love, loss, and longing were inextricable from the human experience. But it no longer demanded my obedience. It no longer dictated my choices. Instead, it existed alongside freedom, a quiet companion to the reclamation of my life. I realized then that avoiding her had not been an act of weakness or retreat. It had been an act of courage, a deliberate, conscious choice to honor the self I had neglected in my devotion, and create a space in which I could grow, breathe, and exist fully, unbound by the capricious tides of someone else's presence. And as I turned the corner to my apartment, drenched lightly in the city's nighttime drizzle, I understood that this liberation was not a fleeting sensation. It was a permanent recalibration, a profound shift in how I inhabited the world, how I observed myself, and how I allowed my heart to pulse, strong and sovereign, in the quiet company of its own truth. The rhythm of my days settled into a gentle, deliberate cadence, one marked not by the anticipation of her arrival or the anxiety of her absence, but by the quiet observances of a life slowly reclaimed. I began to notice how the world unfolded in patterns I had never allowed myself to see, moments of beauty and connection that had previously been eclipsed by the relentless gravity of my fixation on her. The early mornings became sacred, a time for reflection, for walking the streets with no agenda, but noticing the small details, the golden shimmer dawn over wet pavement, the way a stray cat would pause on a wall and tilt its head at the city's bustle, the faint scent of bread and coffee drifting from corner bakeries. I started to keep a journal again, recording these impressions, not as evidence of someone else's importance in my life, but as testimony to my own presence, my own capacity to observe, to feel, to exist fully and attentively. In these moments, I realized that avoidance was not simply about refusing her access to my world. It was about creating room for my own life to breathe, to expand in directions that had previously been closed off. I found myself lingering in bookstores, tracing my fingers along spines of novels and memoirs, letting the words and the paper's texture sink into me, absorbing knowledge, feeling emotion, and allowing imagination to flourish unchained by the shadow of her absence. Each page I read became a conversation with someone unknown, a dialogue that was untainted by the complicated history of longing and disappointment. And yet, the memories of her were never completely absent. They hovered like a distant melody, faint melancholy, but no longer commanded my attention. I remembered her laughter, her soft insistence on certain choices, the way she had once sketched tiny doodles in the margins of notebooks I had left lying around. I allowed these recollections to exist as a part of my history, but I no longer permitted them to dictate my present. The cafe became an anchor in my routine, a place where I could sit and witness life unfolding around me without needing to force my own narrative to align with someone else's. I watched people meet, part, smile, argue, reconcile, and in their stories, I found both empathy and inspiration. Life continued, beautiful, messy, imperfect, and entirely independent of her influence. One evening, as I lingered past closing, the amber light spilling onto the empty street outside, my phone vibrated with a message from her, short, seemingly casual, but heavy with unspoken expectation. I stared at it, feeling the familiar rush of tension, the old ache that once pulled me backward into anxiety and obsession. But this time, the feeling was tempered by a steady awareness, a calm understanding that her intrusion no longer carried the power to unsettle the foundation I had worked so hard to rebuild. I did not respond. I let the message sit unacknowledged, and in doing so, I felt a quiet surge of triumph, a small but undeniable victory over the old pattern of seeking validation, of bending my emotional life to accommodate someone else's inconsistency. The weeks that followed continued in this rhythm of observation, reflection, and deliberate choice. I took longer walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, discovering parks I had never noticed, cafes tucked into alleys, small galleries with exhibits that sparked joy or provoked thought. In these explorations, I felt my sense of self expanding, gaining depth and richness that had previously been stifled by my focus on her presence. I began to enjoy solitude in a way that was deeply nourishing, a quiet companionship of my own thoughts and emotions, rather than the anxious, clinging loneliness I had once mistaken for devotion. Nights became opportunities for quiet reflection, for writing, for listening to music that resonated with the subtle layers of emotion I had learned to embrace rather than suppress. Occasionally, I would see her in passing, a fleeting figure across a street or in a cafe window, and for the first time, her presence no longer demanded my attention. I felt neither anger nor longing, only a gentle acknowledgement that she existed in the world, and that our paths had diverged. The liberation I felt was not a loud, dramatic declaration, but a subtle, pervasive sense of sovereignty over my own life. I was free to think, feel, move, and exist on my own terms, and that freedom became a source of quiet exhilaration. I realized that the act of avoidance, of setting boundaries and refusing to let her whims control my emotional landscape, had unlocked something I had not known I possessed. A deep, unwavering resilience, a capacity to honor my own needs and desires, and a clarity of vision for the kind of life I wanted to build. Each day, each quiet moment of reflection reinforced the understanding that love, connection, and joy could exist fully and authentically without dependence on someone whose choices had previously held sway over my heart. And in this understanding, I found a peace that was both fragile and enduring, a luminous clarity that came not from erasure of memory, but from a deliberate cultivation of presence, autonomy, and quiet, resilient strength. Autumn had fully settled into the city by the time I truly began to feel the full weight of my own freedom. The trees lining the streets had surrendered their green leaves to shades of amber, gold, and deep crimson, and as the wind swept them into swirls across the sidewalks, I felt an almost symbolic resonance in the motion, a release, a letting go, a natural unfolding of life that mirrored my own journey. I wandered through familiar neighborhoods, but they felt transformed, illuminated by my newly attentive perception, each detail resonating with a quiet poetry I had long ignored. I noticed the way sunlight struck the corners of windows, casting fractured patterns across brick walls, the subtle creak of shop doors opening and closing, the delicate scent of roasted chestnuts mingling with the crisp air. It was as though the world had become more intricate, more alive, because I was finally seeing it without the haze of expectation clouding my view. At Meow's Cafe, I found my favorite corner by the window, the warm glow of light spilling over my journal, as I scribbled observations, reflections, and fleeting thoughts. I wrote about my days, the people I encountered, the ephemeral beauty of moments that had once gone unnoticed. And in doing so, I realized that writing had become more than a pastime. It was meditation, a conduit through which I connected to the essence of my own life, acknowledging joy, grief, longing, and liberation as equally vital components of existence. The process was slow, deliberate, almost sacred. Each sentence carved space for me to inhabit fully, to recognize the contours of my own mind and heart without deferring to someone else's desires or unpredictability. Occasionally, her presence crept into my thoughts, a flicker of memory, the echo of a laugh, the trace of a word she had said that had once held profound weight. But now, instead of the obsessive longing that had previously dominated me, there was only a quiet, reflective acknowledgement. She was a chapter, not the whole book, a melody I could recall without being swept into the tide of past obsession. I began to feel the subtle power of choice crystallize in ways I had never fully grasped. When her name appeared in a fleeting notification, or when I caught a reflection in a cafe window across the street, I did not act. I did not falter. I observed, noted, and returned my attention to myself, my day, my own unfolding story. The act of not responding, of remaining present in my own life rather than hers, became a profound affirmation of my autonomy. I no longer waited for validation, affection, or recognition from someone whose commitment had proven inconsistent. My days became structured around intentional experiences, long walks in neighborhoods I had never explored, afternoons spent writing in sunlit corners, evenings of music and introspection, and quiet dinners where I allowed myself to savor not just food, but the undisturbed rhythms of solitude. In these rituals, I began to see the beauty of self-containment, the quiet strength of heart that can love without dependency, that can feel grief without succumbing to despair, and that can hope without clinging. There were moments of longing, of course, brief flickers that reminded me of the depth of past attachment. But even these were tempered by reflection, by the understanding that attachment had once been reciprocal, playful, intimate, yet had also been weighted by inconsistency, absence, and unmet expectation. I did not need to erase these memories. I only needed to reframe them as elements of my growth rather than sources of continual suffering. One evening, as the amber glow of the cafe light spilled across the wet streets outside, I wrote a sentence that surprised me with its quiet power. I am enough entirely and unconditionally without her presence in my life. The realization was neither dramatic nor sudden. It was a slow, unfolding clarity that radiated through every fiber of my being. I felt the pulse of freedom in my chest, an exhilarating yet peaceful force, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you can soar rather than fall. Avoidance had not been an act of cowardice or spite. It had been a careful cultivation of resilience, the conscious shaping of a heart no longer subject to the whims of another. And in that space, I felt the first true stirrings of creative inspiration, the kind that arises not from longing for someone else, but from being fully present in your own life, attuned to the details, rhythms, and textures that previously went unnoticed. I began sketching small scenes from my daily wanderings, capturing shadows, reflections, fleeting gestures of strangers, and the soft golden light of cafes and street lamps. Each drawing, each sentence, each observation felt like an affirmation. I was here, alive, present, and no one could diminish that reality. The realization settled deeper when I walked home one rainy evening, the city shimmering under the wet streets, reflections of neon signs dancing like fleeting specters in puddles. I noticed a woman with an umbrella, laughing with a friend, entirely unself-conscious, and I felt a sense of profound connection, not to her, not to anyone else, but to life itself. The vibrancy of existence did not depend on her attention, on a message returned, or a presence confirmed. My autonomy, my perception, my joy were entirely my own. And as I stepped across the slick pavement, breathing in the cool, rain-washed air, I felt an unshakable certainty settle into me. Avoidance had freed me, and in that freedom, I had discovered something infinitely more precious than any promise she could have kept. I was whole, resilient, and quietly, luminously alive. By the time winter arrived, the city had transformed into a quiet palette of muted grays and soft whites, the streets dusted with frost, the lamplights glowing like distant fireflies against the early evening dusk. I walked through these softened streets with a profound awareness of the subtle rhythms of life, a gentle attentiveness to detail that I had once forfeited in the turbulence of longing. Each breath of cold air filled me with clarity I could scarcely have imagined months before, a reminder that my life, my existence, was entirely my own to shape. I passed familiar cafes, including Meow's Cafe, its warm amber glow spilling onto the icy pavement, and felt an intimate sense of connection not tied to anyone else but to the spaces I claimed for myself. I sat inside for hours, journal open, coffee in hand, watching life move around me, the hum of conversation, the clatter of cups, the subtle exchange of smiles and gestures that conveyed 1,000 small human stories, each complete and independent, a gentle affirmation that life did not require her presence to be vibrant or meaningful. Occasionally, I thought her, not with longing, not with bitterness, but with a quiet acknowledgement that she had been a chapter in my life, one that taught me about attachment, disappointment, hope, and ultimately, self-possession. I reflected on the messages she had sent, the appearances she had made and failed to make, the cycles of anticipation and absence, and I realized that all of it had contributed to this singular clarity. I could exist fully, richly, and vibrantly without her. Avoiding her had not been an act of erasure, but an act of affirmation, a declaration to myself that my emotional landscape belonged entirely to me. I began to notice the subtle pleasures of being unbound, the slow unfolding of a morning without expectation, the quiet satisfaction of a task completed for no one else, the unhurried joy of observing life without the interference of longing for someone who had repeatedly made themselves unavailable. There was a richness in solitude, a depth and attentiveness to the present, that I had never experienced while my heart orbited her presence. I wrote for hours, each sentence a testament to self-reclamation, a careful cartography of my own emotional terrain, the contours of grief and hope, joy and reflection, all contained within the space I now fully inhabited. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside the cafe windows, coating the streets in a quiet white hush, I realized that her name no longer sparked tension, anxiety, or desire. It existed merely as a note in the symphony of my past, a memory acknowledged, honored, but not commanding. I could recall her laugh, her gestures, even her absence, without the gnawing need for validation or presence. It was a liberation I had once thought impossible, an unshakable peace that pulsed quietly beneath the rhythm of my days. When I walked home that night, the streets hushed and glowing under the snow, I felt a profound gratitude, not for her, not for the cycles of waiting and disappointment, but for the freedom I had earned through deliberate choice. I realized that avoidance had not left me empty. It had opened space for life, creativity, observation, and self-possession. I paused at the corner near my apartment, watching the city's lights shimmer on the snow, and recognized that this was the first time I truly felt the quiet thrill of autonomy. The world was vibrant, my heart intact, my mind alive with curiosity and intention. I no longer carried the burden of waiting, the weight of someone else's inconsistency, or the pull of hope tethered to unreliability. Instead, I carried the steady, luminous pulse of my own presence, the exhilarating awareness that I was capable of navigating life, love, and loss on my own terms. Freedom, I understood, was not merely the absence of her. It was a full reclamation of my story, the unambiguous acknowledgement that I was enough entirely and completely without seeking permission or attention from anyone else. That night, as I stepped inside my apartment and watched the snow swirl against the windows, I allowed myself to smile fully, freely, without hesitation or restraint. I no longer anticipated disappointment. I no longer measured my worth by the attentions of someone who had repeatedly failed to honor it. The liberation was quiet but profound, a steady glow that radiated from within, illuminating even the small, shadowed corners of my mind and heart. In that space, I understood the paradox of love and loss, the fragile balance between memory and presence, longing and autonomy. And in this understanding, I finally felt whole. Avoidance had freed me, yes, but it had done more than that. It had allowed me to reclaim myself, to feel deeply, to observe the world with attention and care, and to inhabit my own life fully, without hesitation, without apology, and without the shadows of her influence. I sipped my coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest like sunlight on snow, and knew, without question, that I had arrived at a place of quiet triumph. I was alive entirely and irrevocably in my own story, and that story no longer required anyone else to define its contours. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, relentless, beautiful, and I was free.